Under construction is a perfect description of how the new Trump administration, with a hands-on approach, is drafting a new roadmap for the USA. How will this impact regulations and industry? While many things are still in flux, we can already define the outlines. To comprehend the impact of the current directions, a good understanding of the past is needed. So time for a bird's-eye view on the US TSCA, its roadmap for 2025, including lessons learned from the manufacturer-requested risk evaluations. I'm happy to discuss these topics with Melissa Schisler from Dow and David Fischer from Keller and Heckman. David, during the first Trump administration in 2016, you were Deputy Assistant Administrator at the US EPA. A time when the bipartisan Lautenberg Act, an important TSCA amendment, was signed into law. Can you describe how the TSCA revisions and implementation since then made it more effective?
Yeah, so I would say the goal of the Lautenberg amendments was to completely change TSCA in every way. Both the new chemical provisions, the existing chemical provisions, and lots of other aspects of TSCA. Unfortunately, what was anticipated to happen didn't actually happen. The new chemical program slowed down, there were backlogs, and EPA's really never recovered from that because the changes in TSCA, I kind of describe it as they received lots of bipartisan support and industry and other stakeholder support, but it was as if they built a machine and nobody actually turned it on to see if it worked. And it really didn't work. And it's still not working. Now, I should say though that TSCA did for the very first time mandate risk evaluations for existing chemicals. So that's a good thing. On the other hand, the way it's been implemented is very slow, very time consuming, and at this rate, it'll probably take an unbelievable number of years to get through all of the existing chemicals that have not heretofore been evaluated. So that's why I'm a big proponent of amending TSCA again.
Okay, thank you. So it could take another decade, more or less. Melissa, what is your view on the TSCA amendments and journey from the last decade?
Yeah, I would say, industry really does believe in sound chemical management. And so we were very supportive of the amendment because we did feel like maybe there was a gap in assessing chemicals. So to your point, David, the risk assessments of existing chemicals are important. And we think that it needs to be durable and we think it needs to be enforceable. And I mentioned earlier in my talk that we believe that's our responsibility, and we do agree with that. Now, I would say in the last 10 years, it hasn't been implemented well, and unfortunately, we've seen a lot of differences between administrations, which doesn't help us progress. And I'll specifically maybe point out new chemical program without the lack of assurance that I can get those new chemicals on there. Many companies are looking to perhaps sell or make those chemicals in other areas. So I think implementation has been difficult, and I think the lack of that durability in implementing has been really has limited our progress.
Okay. The US and especially EPA is at a crossroad where it seems it will be my way or the highway. What key changes to the TSCA implementation can we expect in 2025? And can we perhaps expect policy changes affecting the prioritization of chemicals for risk evaluation?
So thanks for that. I would say yes, we will, without question, see policy changes. And you may ask, well, why would that be if, one would think that TSCA itself would propose one policy direction, not multiple. And unfortunately, that is not the case, and that's one of the flaws with TSCA. There's too much ability to interpret what the statute might say or what various administrations might think it says. Having said that, though, we will definitely see kind of a reversion back to Trump 1's view of how TSCA should be implemented. I mean, there's no question that that will happen. It will take a lot of time, though, for that to happen. And as I'll mention in my talk tomorrow, EPA is still getting staffed up with any number of political appointees. They clearly don't, at this stage, have enough folks to to do all the things that need to be done. So that in and of itself will slow things down. But we will definitely see changes, and certainly a receptivity from the EPA to start to implement those changes, right? Those policy changes, until hopefully we get to a new status quo, which I hope will include amended TSCA again. That's very possible to happen in 2026, actually.
David, in 2019, EPA proposed for 20 chemicals high priority chemical substance evaluations. What is the current status of these evaluations, and how many evaluations are currently in process?
Yeah, so there are, as you mentioned, there are 20. There's just one or two that have been finalized, so they're final risk evaluations. But all of them, of course, are years late, right? They should have been completely done, and they should have been, EPA should have been engaged in risk management quite some time ago. But again, that is an indication of how one administration can view TSCA very differently than the previous administration. And those sort of back and forth, kind of a seesaw approach to policy is not only disruptive to industry, as was mentioned by Melissa, but also very disruptive to EPA staff. You know, sometimes they have to go back to the same risk evaluation once, twice, three times maybe, depending on who is running EPA.
So once in a while they return to the same roundabout and just take a different exit, but then return again?
So the 20 are still in process, but it will take any number of additional years to get them through.
Okay. TSCA allows a manufacturer of a chemical to request an EPA-conducted risk evaluation on the chemical substance. And there's the so-called manufacturer-requested risk evaluation. What are the key differences between EPA-initiated risk evaluations and those MRREs under TSCA?
Yeah, good question. So Congress did put this aspect into the 2016 Lautenberg Act, where manufacturers like myself, we could initiate a risk assessment for EPA. And we really thought that was a benefit, because when we would do that, we would think that we have all the data, we are confident in our uses, that we would get a no-risk outcome. That's the benefit. And it also had a time frame. You mentioned, the first 20 are still going through. It's taken some time. With the MRREs, we were on a time frame that we thought would be amenable to us as well. The downside of that is implementation has changed TSCA quite rapidly. And so having that data, what we thought would be appropriate for the risk assessment, may have changed by now.
Okay, David, anything
to
add?
And one of the biggest changes is, once upon a time, for the initial MRREs, the submitter, the manufacturer, could simply select those conditions of use that they were engaged in, and then EPA would fill in the other conditions of use. Because after all, it made sense. Why would you expect a manufacturer like Dow to know all the different uses, right? All the downstream uses. Well, that's completely changed now. So the Biden EPA went back into the risk evaluation procedural rule, amended it, and now mandates that, until it's changed, hopefully, again, down the road, mandates that in order to get a manufacturer requested evaluation approved by EPA, you need to demonstrate that you've gathered all the data. Even though you're paying EPA well over $1 million to actually do the work, do the evaluation, you still need to do all the upfront work. So that's probably one of the biggest changes. And that's also why you haven't seen anybody, and no manufacturer has initiated a MRRE in probably 3 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that wasn't the intent right at the beginning.
Exactly.
The intent, it wasn't going to be much different than if they initiated it. So.
Okay. And maybe now then, or in the Biden era, or before in Trump 1, what criteria does the EPA use to determine whether to grant one of those MRRE requests? So
now, as opposed to when in Trump 1, you have to demonstrate that you in fact have gathered all the data, and so you have to provide all of that to EPA. And if you haven't, then it may not get approved. right? You can't just say, well, we don't know it. You have to actually show a good faith effort of trying to collect all that data. Now, EPA realizes they may need to engage in implementing some of their data collection authority. So it doesn't mean that a company would absolutely have to wouldn't have to generate any data per se. But unless you make a demonstration to EPA, you won't get a thumbs up from the agency to proceed.
And would a EU REACH registration be sufficient to? I mean, you fill out a lot of data points already.
That's an interesting question. I don't think it is. I mean, the regulations are very different from one another, from the European REACH versus the TSCA amendment. So I don't know that it would be the same. Certainly we would add all that data, but we may get more questions about the use and to understand that risk assessment from the EPA view. But it's a good starting point, no doubt.
Okay. Melissa, what are the potential benefits and drawbacks of MRREs for chemical manufacturers like Dow?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have control over that risk assessment and initiating it, right? And again, I'd go back to the timeline of how long, when it gets initiated, because again, we thought we would have all the data to put in for that risk assessment. Therefore, we were confident we'd get a no risk determination based on the data and the use information that we had. Now, the drawback, again, is implementation has taken so long for this that a lot of different procedural attributes have been changing. So whether we have enough data now versus what we thought we had in the beginning is maybe the game has changed. But I think one important thing you said, David, was that engagement with EPA. And I think with our specific example, we've had a lot of engagement with EPA, which has been favorable to have that conversation. I think, as you will likely all know, there's changes within the EPA. So one of the problems is that personnel in EPA change too as you're going throughout these long processes of risk assessment.
Yeah, it almost seems that retrospectively you are seeing it as a risk for Dow that you made that MRRE.
Not necessarily, because again, we're confident in that data.
Yeah.
We really are confident in the data and how much data we have. We're encouraged by the conversations we have. But with our particular case, we haven't seen the outcome of it at this point either.
Can you describe how the MRRE process works and what are the main steps involved, the challenges you face when submitting such a request?
Yeah, I mean, as much as David had said, we initiate that. So we collect our data, we collect our uses, we collect exposure information, we identify our chemistry the way that we identify it. We put it through EPA's CDX system, and then they kind of do a fact check. Do we have all the information that they've indicated we needed to provide to them? And then it goes through a publication. They publicize it to the public, where they have an opportunity to, I think it's about 45 days, if I'm not mistaken, David, to provide comment on that. And then there's a 3-year time frame of when you're going back and forth with EPA to give more information if they need it, answer questions, but you have that 3-year timeline to complete it.
Okay. David, Melissa already mentioned the public. How does EPA ensure transparency and public participation in the MRRE process?
Yeah, so one thing I did want to mention, and I should have mentioned this earlier perhaps, is one of the main reasons why the MRRE process has changed is because the Biden EPA adopted a whole chemical approach to risk evaluation. So that, as opposed to a condition of use by condition of use approach to risk evaluation. So that's why EPA would say, well, that's why we need the manufacturer to give us everything, all the exposure information, all the conditions of use, et cetera. So the public has certainly a role throughout the whole process. As was mentioned by Melissa, there's some initial conveyance to the public regarding the information that's been provided by the manufacturer. Then when EPA does a scoping document, there's an opportunity for public comment. And then when the risk evaluation is drafted, additional opportunities for public comment, et cetera. So it mirrors the EPA-initiated risk evaluation process.
Okay. There is a new sheriff in town, with the deputy sheriff heading the Department of Government Efficiency, leading to tremendous cuts in the federal workforce, including hundreds of EPA employees. You already mentioned They are already outstaffed before this. What impact will personnel and staffing changes at EPA have on TSCA implementation? And will this impact also new chemical reviews under TSCA?
Yeah, good question. I can't imagine that it won't impact just about every aspect of TSCA implementation. I mean, that's just going to be inevitable, especially with the uncertainty that career staff are feeling right now. I mean, it's hard to get on with your workday when you have that uncertainty in your mind as well. So it'll definitely impact new chemicals, definitely impact existing chem risk evaluations. And also the ability for the agency to recruit. I mean, how do you recruit new employees in this sort of environment? That's going to be a real challenge.
What kind of challenges do you see?
Yeah, I would say, industry really wants it to be funded because obviously this is our license to sell products within the United States. And so new chemicals and existing chemicals, if there's a reduction in staff or changeover in that staff, it doesn't allow us to have that business case to ensure that we're still innovating within the United States. So that it's one of our major concerns is if they reduce staff or if they change staff, you're constantly going backwards instead of forward. And I think we would encourage Congress to keep funding the EPA because it is our regulatory scheme in the United States and we want to be able to be fruitful in the United States.
Talking about funding, the latest TSCA fee rule is from 2024. Can we expect any updates on TSCA fees the coming period?
So EPA has to have it reauthorized within 10 years. So the TSCA implementation was 2016. So in 2026, we will have the opportunity to have Congress reauthorize it. Now they just updated the fees in 2024, as you mentioned. So I think it's a 3-year cycle that those fees can be changed over time. But this change that they did in 2024, significant increase in the cost of a risk assessment or a pre-manufacturer notification, a new chemical notification.
Okay, David?
Yeah, so with regard to the ability to reauthorize the fee authority for EPA, that also provides, and that's one of the reasons why folks are now talking about amending TSCA again. Since you have to open up the statute anyway to add that reauthorization provision, it provides a golden opportunity to make other changes.
Okay, final question. Former President Andrew Jackson already said, let them enforce it. I would say enforcement matters. Can you define the carrot and the stick in relation to TSCA enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, again, enforcement does matter. It's our competitive advantage if we can comply with the regulations. And so I think that's one of the carrot and stick is just being able to move things through that process. My role in Dow is as a toxicologist. And so data that we have, I'm very confident that we have the information to ensure the safety of our chemistry, both existing and new chemicals. And so the carrot is to be able to provide that data, have them do an appropriate risk assessment based on uses, and to be able to market it in the United States.
David?
Yeah, so I would say that I completely agree with that, with what Melissa just said, but also here's an example of where there's a shortage of political appointees, right? So there's no assistant administrator for the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance. So that's a big problem. A big challenge, which means that the politicals are doing multiple jobs. So it's going to take a while, as I mentioned earlier, for like a new status quo to come to fruition, so folks understand how this new EPA is going to function. It could be a year to the end of this year before we understand.
But what I would say is, hopefully we get to a point where it's durable, that we're not talking Biden versus Trump versus whoever the next person is. That would be
celebrate 50 years of TSCA next year together.
Together, yes.
Thank you both for your bird's eye view on TSCA. We can conclude that the US, and especially EPA, is at a crossroad. It seems that the eagle doesn't hunt flies, but rummages for rabbits. And we all know that the rabbit that runs away lives to fight another day.